I want to invite you to open your Bibles with me to the Gospel of John in chapter 2. We're going to talk about this event, what we watched on the screen, and Jesus' first sign that took place. As we do so, I was reminded this week that there are certain things in life that when they happen, they indicate that everything's about to change. Everything's about to change, right? I was thinking of things about when Bree and I got engaged, right? Engagements are this time where we say, hey, there is a change coming that is going to change everything. Now, Bree would tell you that lots changed for her, but I think lots more changed for me in all of that. I think of times like looking forward to a baby coming and all that's taking place, the little things that you're preparing for, getting items that are needed to care for a baby, maybe getting a nursery ready, buying car seats, maybe getting a new car, a car that works well for a family, maybe instead of that sports car that you had beforehand. Things are changing. All these little events in life that are indicative that the times are upon us, where something is coming, where everything's going to change. And I think that's what we really see here in John chapter 2 with this first sign, this scene that we have in John's gospel, where John is giving us a glimpse. He's welcoming us to join into this event, right? And the purpose for that is because what John is conveying and what Jesus is demonstrating is that there are huge things changing. There are massive changes coming. And what we are going to see is what Jesus is referring to, what John is wanting us to continue to understand. And so John refers to these things. What we see today is the first of what John will say are the signs that Jesus performs, right? We love these miraculous events, and what could happen potentially is as we read these things, in our familiarity, we can lose some of that awe and wonder at the miracles that Jesus performed. But John refers to them, as you'll see in verse 11 of chapter 2, as signs. And throughout his gospel, he will refer to these miracles that Jesus performs as these signs. As signs, they point to something. Signs reveal something. Signs tell us something is happening. So what we know from John's gospel is that these things are not just mentioned as Jesus' showmanship or his party tricks at a wedding, right? That's not why we are told about this particular event at the beginning of John's gospel. But rather, we have to understand as he records these particular events that at least how John's using them, and I believe in how Jesus was intending them to be understood, is that we are operating on multiple levels. Okay, so I want you to, as we work through this passage, to stop and recognize that we have two things going. Kind of as this event unfolds, it's happening on two different levels. The first level of which being the current circumstances, right? We look at this wedding, this scene, and it's not far into our passage today that John tells us that at this wedding, they've run out of wine. There's a problem at hand, and we might be tempted in our modern culture, our modern situation, to look at it and say, well, so what? What's the big deal? Why does that really matter that they ran out of wine? I mean, after all, we're used to going to weddings today that don't have any alcohol involved in them at all. I know my wedding didn't have any alcohol, and I've been to some of your weddings that didn't have alcohol in them. Now, that's relatively normal for us, but to assume that as we look at this particular instance would be to misunderstand the differences between our culture, their culture, between our traditions and their traditions. In their Jewish culture, wine had become a symbol of joy. Throughout the Old Testament, wine and an abundance of wine would be referred to and looked at as a time of prosperity, a time of abundance, a time of celebration and joy. You'll notice, for a couple examples, Psalm 4:7. The psalmist says that you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. He's making a comparison here. Obviously, it wouldn't make much sense to say, you've put more joy in my heart than when times are miserable, right? But he's saying, hey, with all the joy that comes from times that are full of an abundance of grain and wine, you've put more joy, right? Psalm 104 just straight up says that wine gladdens the heart of man. Proverbs 3:10, then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine. So to understand their culture that they are living in, we have to stop and understand that wine had become this symbol of joy and celebration for them. And as such, in their wedding feast, which, by the way, again, different than ours, we go to a wedding for a couple hours on an afternoon, perhaps, and the long ones, when you're almost wondering when it's going to be over, maybe 5 or 6 hours. But their wedding feasts, their wedding celebrations would be spread out over the course of multiple days, maybe even up to over a whole week's time. And it was the expectation that the groom of that wedding would come prepared, that before this celebration would take place, he would have gotten all the things in order. He would have made sure that they had a home. They would have made sure that he had provision for all of the guests to eat and to have wine and to be hospitable for that whole period of time. So to run out of wine in the middle of this wedding feast would have been a big issue. It would have raised some serious problems, especially for this groom. And so as we look at this, and we see, okay, the issue that's raised here, when Jesus turns the water into wine, on one level, he's helping resolve a current issue, an immediate circumstance. That's one level. But I don't think that level is where John intends for us to park. I don't think that level is what John and even Jesus is using as the primary focus of this first sign. I think we have to look at the second level being the level of spiritual significance. And I think as we look at our passage, when this problem comes up, we are told that Mary, or Jesus' mother, comes to him and tells him they've run out of wine. And I think this interaction in some ways between Jesus and his mother helps give us just a glimpse into the spiritual significance that's happening here. Because right away, Jesus responds to his mother and says, "Woman," which for us, we read that and are like, whoa, that's alarming to us. Who would address their mother as woman? Because I know if I ever growing up referred to my mother as woman, I would not be standing here today. I can probably assure you that if I referred to my mother as woman today, you wouldn't see me the next Sunday, okay? That's the difference between our cultures, because Jesus not being rude and degrading here, when we use that term, it comes across that way. It comes across demeaning. It comes across as degrading, right? That's why we would never say woman to our moms. You mothers are like, amen, you better not, right? But Jesus is not being that way. It's actually for him quite a term of endearment. Now let me give you a picture here a little bit, because you're like, how? How could that just be that different? And so what we have to do there is look to the end of John's gospel in John chapter 19, verse 26, all right? At this point, Jesus is hanging on the cross, okay? And as he's on the cross, it says this, that Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. And so he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." I think it's pretty obvious for us that in that instance, Jesus is definitely not being rude. He's not being demeaning in any way, shape, or form to his mother. But in that instance, as Jesus hangs on the cross, he's looking at his mother with a great level of care and concern for her, looking after her provision. So when Jesus refers to his mother as woman, he's not saying, in essence, like the get behind me statement, like, who are you, right? But it is a level of endearment involved with that. In our context today, it might be more similar to us referring to someone as ma'am. Ma'am, like there is a kindness, a sincerity with that. So just to give us a little picture into Jesus' interaction here, because we might read it through our cultural lens and be like, this is really strange stuff going on here. Why would Jesus respond and treat his mother in such a way? But for as endearing as that term may have been that Jesus meant it to be, I still think there's a little bit of separation here. Because as kind as it may have been to refer to his mother as ma'am or this kindness, there is still a disconnect or a difference between calling her mother. There's not the same level of intimacy, not that same level of bond that's used just in that title. And to prove that, I think we look at the rest of Jesus' statement, because he goes on and says, what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with me? And that right there is an idiom, if you will, not an idiot, but an idiom, a phrase that conveys a separation. And we might even use that phrase today. Well, what's that have to do with me? We say that in a way to distance ourselves from the situation. And so as we look at this, Jesus is distancing himself from his mother's statement, and maybe even a little bit from his mother, to demonstrate to us not that Mary's a jerk or that Jesus is a jerk, but that Jesus' authority does not come from his mother. That though she's mom, she doesn't hold all the cards. She's not his master. Jesus has come for altogether different purposes. She doesn't get to call the shots. But like we've learned so far in the Gospel of John, Jesus is the Word become flesh. Jesus is God, and he came not to be swayed and manipulated by the desires and wants of man, but he came to do the will of the Father. Right? So I believe as Jesus responds to this, it's giving a picture that he's not going to deal with this just because mom's asked him to do it. He's not going to do it for those reasons, but because it's going to show us something far greater about who he is and what he's come to do. And that's going to be where we're going to stop and sit as we look at this miracle, because as John uses this story, and I believe throughout how Jesus works this whole thing out, his purpose in doing it was not to deal primarily with that current circumstance, but to deal mostly with the spiritual significance of what's going on. And so we're going to sit there for a little bit today, looking at this, that symbolically throughout this situation, we see the current state of humanity, if you will, right? That without or apart from Jesus, our hope and joy has dried up. That apart from him, we don't have any sense of true celebration, but that Jesus is the one that brings true joy and fulfillment, everlasting. You'll notice later as we get to John chapter 10, Jesus says that he comes to give life and to give it to the fullest. And I think that here we see just a glimpse into this. That Jesus doesn't take this situation where they've run out of wine altogether and provide just enough. But he provides it in abundance. He tells the people to fill these jars to the brim. And Jesus doesn't just provide mediocre wine. He doesn't say, well, they're already well into this wedding feast and celebration, so it just needs to be okay. He provides the best. Right? And I think here we have this picture into what Jesus is demonstrating is going to come in his life and in his ministry. And so as we look at this sign through the spiritual lens, along with that practical lens, I think we begin to see that what Jesus performed is pointing to these major changes that were on the horizon, these major changes that were here in who he was. Now, I don't think that it's a mere coincidence that this took place at the outset of Jesus' ministry. I don't think God does anything by coincidence. I don't think anything happens and God's like, oh, well, that was convenient. I think there's intentionality in what God does. I think there's intentionality in when and how this event unfolded, when it took place. Because up until this time, Jesus' disciples have just started following him. Now, to give you a glimpse, they've really only been with him for at most a week's time. At most a week's time. And they followed Jesus under the premise that he is the Christ, the Messiah, that as Philip testified, he's the one that Moses and the law and all the prophets talked about. We found him. He's the Messiah. And so these guys following Jesus right away, you'll notice in this passage that Jesus doesn't go into the midst of all the wedding guests. He doesn't even go before the bridegroom to perform this miracle, but he does it in the presence of his disciples. Right, that these men may witness what's taking place and they would understand something about who it is that they are following. And so right at the beginning here, I think we begin to see that this first change that Jesus is putting or demonstrating in this sign is the coming of the Messianic age. This is something that the Jewish people would have been waiting for a long time. They've been waiting for the Messiah. When will this man come? And Jesus is demonstrating through this sign, it is now. Now is the time. Now is the inauguration of the Messianic age. Now, earlier I talked a little bit about how wine had become a symbol of celebration and joy in Jewish culture, right? And as such, they began to look at this coming of the Messiah as a time that would be marked by great abundance of these things. Take, for instance, Amos, a minor prophet. In Amos chapter 9, verses 13 and 14, it says this, that behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes who sows him who sows the seed. It says that the mountains will drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. Right? And I think there's some interesting things that take place. If we had more time today, we could sit there in Amos chapter 9 for a little while and talk about the allusion to Christ and his blood flowing on the cross and all of this. But the Jewish people would have looked at this messianic prophecy through the lens of, well, when the Messiah comes, there must be an abundance of wine. And so here in this instance, right on the outset of his ministry, though not in view of the entire public, Jesus performs a miracle in which he takes no wine and provides it in abundance. Did you notice here? There's 6 jars. And now for you math whiz people, all right, look at verse 6 here. 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Who's got the math? That comes out to 120 to 180 gallons of wine. All right, Jesus didn't just be like, hey, let me run to Aldi and pick something up. Jesus provides in an abundance. And so his disciples, living in a Jewish culture, watching this unfold through a Jewish worldview or lens, would have started to make a couple connections. Probably would have confirmed for them some things that they were waiting for. Is this really is the Messiah? We believed it, and now look. Don't we remember what the Old Testament said, what the prophets said of this man? And here he is. But wait a second. Didn't Jesus say in his response to Mary that his hour has not yet come? Doesn't that kind of raise some questions for us as we look at this path? Doesn't that kind of make us wonder, why would Jesus seem to distance himself from the situation and say, my hour's not yet come, and then proceed to perform a miracle anyways? Doesn't that seem just a bit strange? I think we have to stop and recognize what it is that Jesus is referring to when he says that. And to do that, I want to stay within the context of the Gospel of John. In John's Gospel, when Jesus or John himself refers to Jesus' hour, he is always looking to the cross in the context of his gospel. John chapter 7, verse 6, Jesus says, my time has not yet come. John 7:30 later will say that no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Now, both those instances, Jesus is well into his public ministry. So we could stop and look and say, hey, well, maybe Jesus was just saying it wasn't time yet for him to start his public ministry. But I would stop and say, even within what we've read already and studied already in the Gospel of John, Jesus is underway in his public ministry. Already, Jesus has been testified to by John the Baptist in a public setting in which resulted in people following Jesus, that he is the Messiah, the Lamb of God. Jesus has gone public in some ways, though maybe not gained all the popularity that he will gain throughout his ministry. He's gone public. Okay, but later, even in John 8:20, Jesus will say, or it will say that nobody arrested Jesus at this instance because his hour not yet come. But then Jesus himself in John chapter 12 says this in verse 23, that the hour has now come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And from that point on, in John's gospel, John shifts the focus to the Passion Week, shifts his focus to the cross and the events and the teachings of Christ that will lead up to that taking place. Early on, Jesus' hour had not yet come. His hour has not yet come. His time has not yet come. Now his hour has. So at the beginning here, and why Jesus jumps to that and says that my hour is not yet come. Jesus understood. And I think as we see, Jesus didn't go out into the mass of that wedding party. He didn't go in front of all the guests and say, hey, check out this party trick. But Jesus performed it in some ways behind the scenes for his disciples to witness it. And I think as he did so, he was conveying to them just a little bit about who he was and what he'd come to do, namely converting the old to the new. Notice in our passage today, notice what Jesus used. Verse 6, these 6 stone water jars were the jars that were used for the Jewish rites of purification. Now, it's interesting that John would include this detail, isn't it? Because if you were to put yourself in the setting there for a second and just think about what's taking place, they've run out of wine, which means the vessels that would have been there to hold the wine that was there before would be empty and in the presence. Now, yeah, you're probably thinking you can't put new wine into old wine vats and all this stuff, right? But Jesus, interestingly, takes the vessels that were used for the Jewish rites of purification. The fact that John even mentions that should tell us something, that there's something significant taking place there. That this is intentional, that Jesus is telling us something, telling his disciples something in what he's going to do. And so he takes those jars that would be used for the ceremonial washings to purify the utensils used for the wedding, the people that they would be able to wash and be pure for this celebration.